So thank you all for joining. As hopefully you're aware, we're going to talk today about game production. These are my top 5 tips that I've learned over the last 13 years or so of producing. And just to kind of give you an overview, these are the top 5 tips that I'm going to cover, which I'll obviously talk through. But really to kind of give an overview, when we think about production, we often talk about things like Agile versus waterfall, JIRA versus Trello, sprints, tasks, milestones. Now, all of those things are obviously really important, but they are tools and rule sets to follow. And there's a lot of books and resources out there for those things. So that's not what I'm going to cover today. What I'm looking at is what actually makes production or a producer successful, and how best to use those tools and those rule sets. Firstly, and the assumption here is that you need to know your field. Obviously, that is a key part of being a good producer at all. But beyond that, what else matters? That's what I'm going to try and cover. So, I've been running game teams, project studios for 13 years or so. And these are the kind of top things that I've built over time. I've managed teams from 3 people up to about a maximum of 25 people, and I've managed projects that take 3 weeks and 3 years. And whilst the level of complication of bigger teams and projects increase, all of these sort of basic rules still apply. Now, there are a lot of ways to manage production. This is my way. I'm completely self-taught because I started my first studio as a graduate. So these are kind of things that I've just evolved over time and learned. So let's get started. So firstly, I'm going to talk about being organized. A producer, basically your job is to spin a lot of plates. You've got to keep reminding people about things, chase for deliveries, keep up to date with everybody's tasks, including your own, keep to deadlines, report to management, plan sprints, attend meetings, coordinate team members, record meeting notes, and so many different things going on as a producer. Depending on whether you run one project or multiple, that may be simpler or more complicated, but either way, you're basically having to manage a huge amount of different things every day. So how do you do that? Now, unless you have an incredible memory, and full declaration, I do not. My memory is absolutely terrible. You need to find ways to track it all. Now, the way I do it, because I know I have such a bad memory, I'm really fastidious about tracking everything. But I do think that even if your memory is better than mine, I think these things are still really important because you can't remember everything. So these are some of the kind of tricks. Now, one thing I would say is that as we go through, you'll see that we use a lot of different techniques. There's a lot of different tools. There's a lot of different things. And that's because, in my view, one single solution doesn't exist. I've spent a long time trying to find a single solution. It would be lovely if there was one tool and one process that worked for everything, but it just doesn't work like that. And I think that what you have to do is actually find systems that are flexible enough to flex and evolve as you progress through a project, through your career and so on. So as you'll see, we use a lot of different things, but actually it's about trying to keep it as simple as possible whilst finding a set of things that work for you. So I'm going to start with the most obvious, to-do lists. Now, I hope everybody on this call has a to-do list of some kind. Seeing as you're here, I'm guessing you have some interest in being organized. But whilst that's pretty obvious, what I think is not always obvious is that the rule with to-do lists is that they're either 100% accurate or you're better off not having one. The purpose of a to-do list is not just to remember things for you, it's actually to free up your brain to do other things without having to retain loads of information, and particularly without worrying about what you've got to do next or what you need to remember. That means that if you can't trust your list completely, it would actually be better to not have one, because you won't be able to free up your brain, so it won't achieve its purpose, but actually you're more likely to forget things than if you knew you had to remember them in the first place. And yes, doing a to-do list in this way does take time to manage. Taking time every day is critical. I often hear people, not mentioning any names, but Oscar, say, I don't have time, I'm too busy. I think that everybody who works with me has probably learned to never say that to me now, but because it does take time, but it's incredibly valuable time that will save time and actually, most importantly, saves projects later. So personally, I update mine in the morning and I often update it at the end of the day too, but I think at least once a day is critical. And how you set up a task list differs per person. So this screenshot here shows what I think is probably a typical to-do list: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. This can be a good way to do it, in my experience, if you have a lot of things that to do and that you need to keep track of daily. However, I actually find it doesn't work in a lot of instances, because projects, particularly games, are very iterative and they evolve. So, tasks come in that have a higher priority and other things get pushed back. So whilst it can feel really organized to look at a to-do list that's like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, in reality, it's actually not representative of what you're going to do. And it's often not the most efficient. And I'll talk in a minute about another way of doing things. In terms of number of tasks, the general rule is to aim to have 3 tasks in your list per day, simply because otherwise the list can become overwhelming and can actually stifle your productivity. Now, if you finish those 3 tasks, you can always pull more tasks in. And you may, for example, have a load of tiny admin tasks for a morning, which you can group together. But being careful to not overwhelm your list is really important. There will be times it's unavoidable, but kind of striving towards that is really key. This is something that somebody told me quite a few years ago, and it really was a game changer, because I used to kind of just have really big lists of everything, and I used to get to a point where I almost didn't know what to do. But kind of focusing on these 3 tasks at a time has really helped me to be more productive. So this is another way to structure a list. This is actually my task list. And what the key things in here are: backlog this week, today, and then I have another field which you can't see, which is tomorrow. And the key there is that rather than trying to plan out my whole week, I know what I need to do in the week, and I just plan kind of today and tomorrow. For me, that works a lot better. But I do actually sometimes vary between the two. So sometimes I just have a week where I've got so many things to do that I really have to keep on track every day. So I will actually change my task list structure as needed. So in some week I might add in extra columns for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, just for that week. So an agile approach to the list structure itself is key. Over the years, I've tried lots of different ways, and I found that the only real way for me to do it is to have the structure that works for me most of the time, and then edit it when it doesn't. I've probably tried, 5, 10, 15 different ways of doing it. And the thing is that I've realized there's no one solution for every scenario that you could end up. Now, to be clear, my task list is particularly complicated because we're managing lots of projects. I have the company to run as well as projects and so on. So if you may find it more simple if you're just kind of working on one game. Some of this may be a little bit more detailed than you need. But the key here that I want to talk about, and I think Emily could probably talk a bit more about this in Q&A, but I think this was particularly useful for her, which is a dump list. So you'll see on the left there, because as I said, keeping a to-do list takes time, and you'll have to do it every day. But throughout the day, you're going to be really busy and not have the time to update it as new tasks come through. It's the single most common thing I hear people sort of say about keeping a to-do list up to date, is that it's really difficult to kind of do that as you're busy through the day. So what we have is a dump list where you can literally throw anything in any format, and then you triage it later when you do an update to your task list. So I literally sometimes put look back at that thing Emily mentioned to me on Slack. And because it's a short period of time before I'm actually going to come back to it, I know that I'll remember what that is. If I left it for a week, obviously I'm not going to be able to find it in the Slack chat, but if I know I'm going to deal with it, later that day, then that's fine. So it's just a really quick way to dump things so that you won't forget later. Now, obviously, there's a lot of other things that you can add to task lists. We usually have the checkbox called blocker, which is simply that we can tick to say, actually, this is blocked by something else, so you can't start it. Due dates are useful if you need them. I don't use them that much. The only time I use them is when I have a really hard deadline, and I'll add that in. Priorities can be useful, and I know that Oscar and I often debate about types of priorities. Oscar is very much a fan of absolute priorities, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And I agree with him in a lot of cases for sort of dev lists and stuff like that. But for things like this, where you're kind of more on a day-by-day basis, I personally use kind of priority 1, 2, and 3, just because I feel that's enough level of detail just to remind me in a day what my actual priorities are. Obviously, dependencies are another one. I think these are much more important if your to-do list is a dev roadmap, for example, where you've got a lot of different people doing a lot of different things and all interlinked. For something like this, where it might just be sort of your general to-do list, I don't personally find it that useful. But depends on the person. I think having a to-do list system that supports dependencies is really important. It's my biggest issue with Trello. Unless they've added it recently, I haven't used it for a while. It was the biggest reason why we stopped using Trello, was because they didn't have dependencies. So what I've shown so far is kind of, individual to-do lists, and a lot of the rules can apply to dev roadmaps. But, within our company, everybody has their own to-do list, and they all manage them slightly differently. But the important thing is that we all have access to each other's. So, again, just to pick on Oscar, he actually uses his calendar as his primary to-do list because he prefers to map out his day and his tasks per day. So the to-do list that we have that's shared actually just has his weekly task list, not daily, and then he pulls those into his calendar. So there's different, the system can support lots of different ways for different people. But as a producer, you're not just managing your tasks. And so whilst you need your own to-do list, you also need to think about the projects as a whole. Now, I'm assuming you have a dev roadmap, and I'm actually not planning to go into much detail on that today, but I'm happy to answer any questions on it. But what we also have, aside from a dev roadmap, is a to-do list per project. And this has the key actions of the project for everybody, but it's all the stuff that isn't in a dev roadmap. This is something that we introduced probably about a year ago or so. Emily can probably remember. And it's been a bit of a game changer, actually, because what we realize is all those little things that the team needs to do that aren't related to dev. So it might be, finding an audio designer, or, remembering that, we need to chase the dev for a build next week, or all those little things that aren't specifically related to the dev roadmap. We pull them out and put them into this sort of big picture project task list, which really helps us to keep it separate and structured. And the way we tend to do this is we have kind of future tasks to do and doing, and then done. But the difference here is that these tasks are for everybody on the project. So the way we work is that once a week we review this. We then work out what tasks need to be done, and we then assign them to the person, which means that they're going to put them in their own to-do list. We then we check the assigned box, and then the next week we just check that the person has done it. Because as a producer, one of your biggest things is just making sure that people have done what they're supposed to do. And I think I used to try and do that within my own task list. So I used to have loads of notes, check that, so-and-so has done this, check that so-and-so has done that. Actually, that's really inefficient way to manage, I've found, because I'm just overwhelmed. It's much better to kind of split that stuff out and have that in a different kind of process that runs alongside. And this has really helped us, like I said, to get that big picture view. And we found that there's a lot less things get forgotten or delayed because of this. And there is going to be some give and take in terms of what works for each team member, for the team as a whole, and for you as a producer. Now you could just tell people this is the way we're doing it, that's that, and to a point you do have to do that, but also you do kind of it's probably beneficial to be able to take into account how different team members work. This does get more difficult the bigger the team, but particularly if you've got a small team, trying to understand how people structure their own tasks. Some people will need more support, some won't, and so on. And I can actually give a non-game example of this. We're currently building a house, myself and my husband, and obviously we've got a team doing most of the work, but we're doing a lot ourselves. And we have a huge task list of things to do that probably spans about 3 years of work. And we were finding that a bit daunting. So what we've actually done is we've got a long-term task list and then a sort of ongoing task list per month, which we pull in on a monthly basis. And that has made it a lot more manageable and a lot less scary when we look at our kind of just current to-do list. We worry about what we're going to do this month rather than all of the things that we've got to do over the next 2 years. So now I'm a bit obsessed about emails. But choosing a good email client, in my opinion, is really important. I actually have one that I buy. And I know a lot of people feel like email clients, there's so many free email clients that why would you bother? I personally have found it is worth it. The Gmail client to me makes me want to cry because it just doesn't support a proper email organization. But most people aren't as obsessed as me, so that's fine. But ultimately, your goal should be to try and get inbox 0 every day, because otherwise things get lost. Personally, I achieve this minimum once a week, usually twice a week. But at any point, I probably don't have more than sort of 5 to 10 emails in my inbox. And for those, if you don't already do this, essentially the rule is, when an email comes in, you triage it. If you're going to reply to it straight away, do so, move it to the relevant folder. Are you going to reply later? Snooze it to the point where you need to do it. Snooze, I think, is the single most important feature, which I think basically all email clients have now. Is there a task that this email was created which you need to do before replying? Add that to do list, snooze the email until you have done the task and are able to reply. Or is there an action for someone else? Assign that task to them and then snooze it to the point where I know I need to check that they've done it. So kind of having this process again avoids me having to add more stuff to my to-do list, but make sure that I don't forget to do anything. And I know how easy it is to just lose emails when you have just like a massive inbox of stuff. It's really difficult to manage.
Ella, can I just ask a quick one that's relevant
to
the lists, the to-do list particularly, I think. Jeremy was asking, are those lists managed in JIRA? So obviously we don't use JIRA, but I believe that you can do a number of these things in JIRA. Do you have any kind of views or thoughts on that?
So I actually don't know JIRA that well because I don't like it. I find it and I've never used it that much because I just find it like too complicated. But I'm pretty sure you could do. I mean, ultimately, any system where you can create a to-do list. I personally like the look of columns in this way, a bit like Trello style. But that doesn't mean that it can't be visualized in a different way. I don't know if JIRA does this sort of style, but the same principle applies, right? You just need to have, a to-do list with different sections. So I imagine it is, but I've always thought of JIRA as more dev. I've just always found JIRA as more dev roadmap focused. So I would question whether you might want to keep JIRA for dev roadmap and use something else for other types of to-do lists. That's another option.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Well,
yeah, I mean, definitely, because no, that's fine. I mean, definitely so we now work with external developers, and I know that a lot of them use JIRA. I used to have in-house developers. We always had a separate system for managing dev roadmaps as we did for to-do lists, even several years ago. So yeah, they might be different.
JIRA, but I don't. Can do so much stuff, but again, when we were using it in Sony, I found it actually detrimental to the efficiency of the organization because there was so much overhead in terms of management. But that's me, and I'm, as you've already seen from Ella, I am the worst.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found that with JIRA, but I can imagine that I know a lot of developers use it, so I think that it obviously has a big benefit in a lot of ways, but it may not be the right thing for these sort of task lists. I don't know if that answers the question. If it doesn't, feel free to.
Yeah, Jeremy's replied saying, yeah, he thinks that what we were showing is very Trello-esque, but it's not Trello. So this was actually Notion.
Yeah, I was actually. I've got my last slide is to talk about the tools that we do use. But yeah, this is Notion, which we now is our primary tool for most stuff. It isn't for everything. As I said, I don't find one tool works for everything, but Notion for us is kind of our main tool now. And I can talk about that.
Just to get us back on track with the email, Jake is gloating that he has zero inbox zero. I personally have about 20,000 emails, but because I don't differently than anyone else does, not sensibly.
Yes. So most of my job on emails is checking that Oscar has replied to the emails that he's forgotten about. They're in his massive list. Cool. So meetings. So agenda and meeting notes is kind of what I want to touch on here. So agendas are important, mainly because you want meetings to be as short as possible and to the point. We've had particular instances where we've literally scheduled a meeting so far in advance that by the time we get there, we've forgotten what it was, or the purpose of the meeting has already been dealt with elsewhere. So actually, we do find it really important. We have agendas for sort of all our meetings. Now, sharing the agenda in advance can be really useful, particularly if you've got kind of external parties. But actually, what we often just do is have it for our own reference as the producer, and we just summarize the agenda at the start of the meeting. But I would say that it is actually important to do, and we are pretty rigorous with this now, and it has really helped to speed things up. We're trying to make as many of our meetings as possible kind of 30 minutes. We try and save the kind of longer meetings for dev calls or more detailed sessions. And then meeting notes. So people will forget what was said or remember things differently within about 30 minutes of finishing a meeting. It happens all the time. So writing meeting notes is really important. Now, we actually often record the meeting too, so that we can just check back. You know, in some cases, you know, for example, if Emily and I are on a call together, Emily might make the notes and then send them to me just to sort of say, you know, is this what you understood? You know, actually, even with the recording, there's often, you know, times where I'll sort of say, oh, well, I actually thought this was what was said. And, you know, sometimes there's a bit of back and forth. It's amazing how much interpretation can be in a meeting. But then we post them for access by everybody in the meeting. Now, we post that in Slack into the relevant channel. But obviously, you know, I think wherever works for you doesn't really matter. It's just somewhere that everyone can access it forever. That's the important thing. Now, the key is deciding what you need to record in the notes. We don't do kind of minute style board meeting notes unless it's a board meeting, because we just don't find that's necessary. We focus on keeping the notes short, and we kind of record the key discussion points. And then the most important thing is that we record two specific things. The first is actions. So, and I know that this probably drives the team mad, but my two key things about actions are that, one, it needs to be clear what the output from the action is. And I know that sounds obvious, but it's really not, because actually a lot of the time things can be quite vague, and it's really important to actually know how are you going to know that that action's being delivered? What is it you're expecting? And then when it will be delivered. Now, so the way we manage this is that when an action gets assigned, obviously the person who it's assigned to records it in their own to-do list, but then we actually set reminders. So there's a Slack app called Task on Bot, which I think we pay for, but it's not much per month. There may even be a free version. We just use it a lot. And what we do is, as you can see, this is kind of a screenshot of it on the screen here, but you can literally create the task within Slack, so below the meeting notes. And we put the task in, we put the due date, and then we assign it to the producer rather than the person, because the person's totally put it in their to-do list. And what we're doing here is literally, again, as producers, saving our own to-do list from getting inundated. But this is going to come up, say I set this for tomorrow, it's going to come up and say, oh, you know, Oscar should have done this. And then I can go and check he's done it and tick it off. Again, for us, this has been a real game changer for stuff not getting dropped, because often, you know, things are talked about in meetings, you say, you know, and then things get lost over time. So this has really helped us to just make sure to chase and check that things are being completed. And I think certainly Emily uses this a lot. And I think I can say that, you know, it is quite useful. And then the second thing, which actually has its own tip number, because this is so important, is tracking decisions. You know, game development takes a long time. There's a lot of people doing a lot of things. And, you know, as we all know, we can't design everything up front. So decisions get made all the time that can really steer the direction of the project. Now, if it's just you making a game, you might, you know, and there's no other people kind of involved that are accountable, you might not need to do this as much. But as soon as you've got any kind of stakeholders, you know, a decision can seem like the best decision ever or the smallest decision ever at the time you make it. But, you know, months down the line, the impacts can be huge and could be negative, because maybe the context in which you decided it has changed. And then a stakeholder, it could be your boss or a client or a colleague, is going to want to know why that decision was made. So it's really important to track decisions as a producer. I would say it's one of the single most important things you need to do. Is keep a record of how the project has progressed. Recall what was discussed, what was agreed, and the rationale behind it. And then make sure any stakeholders who it affects are aware of the decisions. In some cases, that might actually need their like explicit okay and sign off. But in other cases, you may just want to let them know. So again, there's a Slack app that we use called Cloverpot, but there's probably a million ways to do this. With this one, you literally put in the subject of the decision, you put in the details, and then you tag the people who contributed to making the decision. Now, there are other things in here. You can actually require sign off, you can add reasons, you can add, you know, and all these different things. But the point is that this is then recorded in Slack forever. And it's, you know, for us, it's been really important. And the reason is it's important for accountability. I think people often confuse responsibility and accountability. In producer world, the way I think about it is that tasks are a responsibility decision tracking is about accountability. And if you're not decision tracking, you're only doing 50% of your job. That is how important decision tracking is. And I have worked on a lot of projects with a lot of third parties, and I honestly can't remember anybody actually tracking decisions properly. You know, I've worked, particularly where I've worked on projects where I've managed projects or teams as a third party on behalf of investors. And honestly, this is the single biggest issue that comes up. You know, something goes wrong, everybody's trying to blame each other. Without any kind of decision tracking or history, it's impossible to identify accountability. And I've literally seen investors pull out of projects because nobody can prove that the thing that was done that has now had a bad effect was done for a good reason. So it really can make projects fail. It can make, you know, stakeholders pull out. It's a huge thing, and it's actually very, very simple to do, but for some reason people don't do it. And one of the reasons it's important is that hindsight is a really dangerous thing, because the context in which the decisions you make, the context in which you made the decisions gets lost in time. So, you know, at the time you'd have thought this is the best idea ever. But, you know, in a few months' time, you've made other changes to the game, you've done other things. The decision may seem ridiculous. And actually, without being able to look back, it may even seem ridiculous to you as the person who made it, because you may not remember. You'll be like, why did I do that? And we've had several moments in projects with clients where they've questioned something that we've done due to something they wanted at the time. And the only way that, you know, hasn't caused a major issue is because we've been able to point to the decision recorded and say, well, this is what happened. If you remember, this is what was said. And, you know, that saved a huge amount of pain, and actually probably saved money and potentially our sort of relationships and, you know, work. So, okay, so asking stupid questions. This is probably my favorite one. So I think, but it's actually very difficult, you know, particularly when you're new to producing, you feel under pressure to do your job well. It's really tempting to kind of nod wisely and make important looking notes when you don't understand something, because you think, well, you know, that's very technical. Maybe I don't need to know that, you know, or, you know, maybe you're worrying that you should know. Maybe you're worried that you've forgotten or you weren't listening. Maybe you're worried you'll annoy someone or you'll look stupid. But the reality is that asking those stupid questions is absolutely critical to being an effective producer. You know, without those questions, assumptions get made, misunderstandings happen, and projects can literally go in the wrong direction for months before it's picked up on. You know, and the key question to ask yourself is, you know, do I genuinely understand what is being discussed? If someone asks me later, can I explain it to them? So, you know, if you're having a meeting and you know that your boss is going to want a summary, you know, if they say to you, well, what did that mean? Could you explain it? And if you are making an assumption, and if you're sort of thinking, well, I think I understand it, but I'm assuming this, if you're not going to clarify it, at least state the assumption and just make sure that when, you know, that the assumption is clear and identified. Because the reality is it actually takes confidence to admit you don't understand. When you don't have experience, or you're in a situation where you feel you have something to prove, it's really, really tough. So, you know, it is very, very difficult to do this. But the key here, and this is kind of a company thing, is it's important to know that you're in a supportive environment, and it's really important to set some ground rules. The biggest one being, there is no such thing as a stupid question, you know, and setting that within the entire team, within an entire meeting, you know, it is really important, and everybody needs to be on the same page. You know, talking down to someone because they ask something is an absolute no-no without exception. You know, it doesn't matter how stupid the question is, it is always taken, you know, with, you know, treated with respect. And I think as soon as you have that kind of environment, it will make things easier for people to have the confidence to ask. And so on the other side of that, apart from asking stupid questions, the sort of another side is asking difficult questions. Because sometimes people are vague without even realizing it, but because it's just easier, you know, particularly if you've got a really complicated design challenge you're trying to deal with, or whatever it is, you know, maybe there's some R&D that's needed on tech, or, you know, it's sometimes much easier just to sort of give a vague answer, and they might not even realize they're doing it. It's not necessarily done intentionally, but your job as a producer is to challenge them and get them to really think it through. You know, it's not answered until we actually all understand it and know what the specific action is or the specific outcome is. And again, that kind of smart, making sure things are measurable, timely, and so on. The same thing applies here. Particularly it annoys designers, by the way, just so you know. Oscar finds this really frustrating, I know, but sometimes it's very easy to kind of say, a sort of ethereal answer, and actually getting them to really kind of nail down what it is they're going to do and what needs to be done is really critical.
I should probably just quickly jump in there, because I think although it's frustrating at the moment, it's actually a hugely satisfying thing as a designer to be forced to go through it. Once you get through the end result, it's actually a hugely satisfying thing, and you shouldn't be put off by the fact that as a human being, anyone who's having their suggestions questioned is going to find it difficult to sometimes convey, particularly in my case where I already have exactly every part of the puzzle already laid out in front of me. It's in my head. But Ella's job is to extract it from my head into a form that anyone that's human could understand.
Yeah, and I think this is really the thing of why designers and producers, firstly, are needed, because they're kind of two sides of a spectrum, but also why it's often a bit at loggerheads sometimes, because as a producer, you're, like Oscar said, you're trying to get that idea into a form that is then can be turned into a dev task, or can be communicated to a client, or whatever it is. And it's really, really important. And actually, this doesn't just apply to meetings. This also applies to game design documents. We always, whenever we're writing a game design, we get a producer, usually me, to go through it and question all of the things in it, for that reason, because actually, as Oscar said, a designer may have it in their head, but actually explaining it in a way that is understandable can actually be quite difficult. And then just the kind of last thing on this point really is that getting people to repeat things back, or repeating things back yourself, is just another step in kind of making sure that there's no assumptions and making sure there's clarity. So I often say to people, explain it to me like I know nothing about games. And I also then often repeat back what I believe they've said, and the amount of times that what I repeat back, it turns out, is not what they were saying, it is pretty incredible. So I think it's really important to say, I think what you said is this, is that correct? Is a really important thing to do. So making complicated things simple. So obviously, being a producer is largely about communication, whether it's working with a team to identify dev and art tasks, from a designer, whether it's creating new processes, being able to deliver clearly and in a way that's easy to follow is key. But it's actually very, very difficult to make complicated things easy or simple. Particularly when the information you're trying to communicate is actually really complicated, you've got many moving parts, dependencies, unknowns, estimates, lots of people, and this can be everything from writing a GDD to writing a release process, to writing a user testing process. We've, as some of you may know, we've recently expanded into publishing, and so one of our new things that we've been building out is our UA testing program, which is essentially a set of different tests that we can run to establish, the potential for the game at very early stages. That's actually quite a complicated process. What we wanted was a process that is understandable to the developers we're working with, and provides clear structure of what we're going to do, when we're going to do it, what is needed when, and the output of that. So, but an easy way for us to input the information. And we have done that, but actually creating those sort of things can be quite complicated. And actually, I would say that, turning something complicated into something that is easy to digest is a skill that took me years to learn, and I'm still always improving on it. But just some key considerations. So templating. And I know that Emily and Oscar can probably validate this, but this is one of the things I'm a bit obsessed about. Creating structure for people to fill in really helps save time. I know that games are creative and no game is the same, but that doesn't mean that there isn't games are still systems, and they still have ways of being structured. So being able to provide templates that make it easier for people to provide information, and then easier for that to be consistently communicated, is really helpful. So we have templates for GDD, for example, which means that when Oscar or Glyn, our other designer, are writing a GDD or writing a feature for a developer, we know what kind of format is going to come to us in, and it takes us a lot less time to review it and then feedback to the developer and so on. So templating wherever you can for things that are going to be repeated is really helpful. And again, we use Notion for things like this because it's so easy to do that. Processes. So in the same way as templates, creating processes that are predefined, as I sort of said about our UA testing program, is really important. Now, this comes down to systems thinking, which is a skill in itself. And, is again, a real challenge to kind of get to grips with. But, knowing how to build systems that are easy to follow, complex systems that are easy to follow is a real skill. The way I do it, and again, this is self-taught, but so there's probably, other ways to do it. But, we do this from a GDD through to any kind of process. But, if you're explaining something to somebody from scratch where they have no previous context, the most important thing is that they can get a picture in their head as quickly as possible of the big picture of the project, right? Because if you make them read through an entire GDD with all of the detail before they get the whole picture, they just won't be able to build that picture in their mind. It's too much information. So what you need to do is start at high level and then gradually break down as they read through it. So, for a GDD, which is probably the most obvious, we always start with a short summary overview of the game. Then we break down into sort of core features. And we have a rule that no game ever has more than 3 to 5 core features. And I've never been proven wrong. If anybody can find a game that they think goes against that. But and what we then do is we map those out in a flow and we explain those at a high level. Probably a couple of paragraphs per feature. So by the time you've read this kind of 1 to 2 page document, you know what the game is. Yeah, you might not know exactly how the score system works. You might not know exactly what rewards you're going to get. You might not know exactly what, whether it's range or melee combat at what point, and all the different variables. But you've got a picture in your head of what the game is. Once you've got that, then you can start to break down more features, go into use cases and all the other things. But having that overview document is really important. And the amount of GDDs I see that literally just dive straight in and make me read 20 pages before I even know what the game is, that doesn't help to communicate. And actually what we found is that it actually doesn't necessarily help developers either, because it's difficult to digest that information and sort of know where to look. So yeah. A small point, but an important one. I know this is a bit of a cliche, but I'm just going to say it anyway, because I think it's that important. Never ask if somebody has understood you. Always ask if you've explained it clearly. This comes back to giving people permission to ask stupid questions and giving people permission to say no. Have I explained that clearly? No. If you say, have you understood it? It's much harder for someone to say no because you feel stupid. So it's a minor thing, but a really important kind of technique to get. And then anticipating problems. Now, this is kind of the one thing that is really all about experience in your field, because it's difficult to anticipate potential problems unless you have the knowledge and experience of the type of projects you're working on. And even within games, going from, a VR game to an AR game, there's going to be things that only a producer who's worked on AR games before is going to be able to anticipate. So, obviously there are a lot of transferable things as well, but this is really important. And it's actually, I think, all of these things here, these making complicated things simple, these are the things that separates a junior producer from a senior producer. Managing task lists and all that sort of stuff, they're things that you can put processes in place and just kind of execute on. All of these things about making complicated things simple are about creating the systems and the processes on which you then act. And that is the difference. So this is kind of the advanced side of production, really. Creating templates and processes, anticipating issues. These are all things that actually you're defining the process rather than just using it. So they are complicated and they will take time, and they're not something that you could be expected to do immediately, and they're not something that will just come through just reading a tutorial or even just listening to this webinar. They're going to take time for you to learn, and they're going to take time to build on. But the only way to get started is to just give it a go. And as you go, I've been doing this for 13 years. This sort of stuff, I would say, I didn't even start thinking about most of this stuff, for several years, because it just, I was just trying to make sure that the team didn't fall apart, because, and I had a task list that worked. So it really does take time. So point 5, every team is different. every project is different, every stakeholder is different, every producer is different. There is no one size fits all on how to manage production or a project. Your job as a producer is fundamentally to enable your team to be the best they can be and facilitate them to deliver the best project possible, hopefully on budget, hopefully on schedule, and hopefully to spec. And when we talk about, kind of the produce, you being a producer, we often think about obviously what type of manager you are. Avoiding the pitfalls of micromanaging, avoiding being a helicopter manager, being good at delegation. These are really key skills and difficult skills. Particularly delegation is not an easy thing. But there's a lot of books on this, a lot of resource on this. So hopefully you're kind of aware that these are things you need to learn. But the other side of that is, what type of management your team needs. Yes, you're going to have a management style as a person, and that's going to evolve and improve over time. But actually, that style also needs to be responsive to the needs of the team, each team member, and the specific project. A key consideration, and again, this goes from kind of, being a junior producer to more senior, is working out how best to manage a project or team in a specific scenario, and in particular, what level of detail is required. For example, some team members are going to probably need a more hands-on approach to managing their tasks, because actually they may not be so naturally good at organization. Others are going to thrive on having more freedom. Some projects are more risky and complicated than others, and so need more detailed kind of consideration and management. Some clients or bosses want more reporting or want to be more involved than others. So being able to tailor your approach to the specific needs of the project, the team, and the team members, and work out what that approach is really important. And again, that does come with experience, but again, as with the tools and as with everything else, it's about being able to be flexible and apply your kind of principles and the way you do things to the needs of the specific moment that you're in. And when you work with someone new, with a new team, you're going to need time to find all this out. And really the only way to do that is put in place processes, that help you work that out and then evolve them. I've come into, when I was doing consulting, I've been brought into companies and teams where they need help with processes, whether it's operational processes for the company or production processes for a project. And they sort of say, well, what should we do? And the first thing I say is, well, the only way to know for sure is to do it. So I'll put in place processes. I kind of have a standard set of processes, as it were. But I will always say that these are going to change. Some of these are not going to work. And until I work with you as people and the project, I'm not going to know where to evolve it. And it generally takes, I would say, on a long-term project and team, 3 months, 6 months to really kind of bed down and work out what's going to work best.
Hello, a quickie for you. Jake made a good point. Do you want to define helicopter management? Because I think that not everybody will understand that term.
Sure. So helicopter management is like the people is there's probably a better definition for this, by the way, if you Google it. But basically, it's people who zoom in and like, I'll solve all your problems and give loads of orders and like tell people loads of stuff and then bugger off again.
Yeah, I mean, there's several different ways of it. I mean, we used to refer to that particular variant as seagulls because they would come in and shit on you. The other type, which is the more kind of traditional knife code, which is actually the one Jake just Googled, is where they just hover over you constantly and take away all the decision making. So basically, they take away all they leave you the accountability, but they don't leave the responsibility. So
and that's basically the definition of bad delegation, really. That's the thing. It's kind of, so there's a huge amount of books on this. The one that I read years and years ago that I really liked, that is a super short book and takes about 20 minutes to read, is The 1 Minute Manager. I really like that book. I thought that was really good. And there was a lot of stuff in there that I found really useful. If anybody, I have a few other books, if anybody's, generally, like when it comes to managing and production, I have a lot of books that aren't game specific, that are just kind of general management, because anything where you're managing people applies to production. So yes, you can buy a book on Kanban and Agile and stuff like that, and specific to games or digital projects, and they're really useful. But I do think there's a huge value in reading books about managing people, or even doing training courses on managing people, because all of those skills kind of apply at any level of being a producer, whether you're a junior producer, or an COO. Managing people is key to what you need to do.
For me, one of the things that I think is really important to do is to step back and kind of think about how are you empowering the person to do their job to the best of their ability. And that means that they need to be bought in to that it's theirs, that they have ownership on it, and that it matters to them, not just that they're going to get their bonus, but they want the output to be good. And sometimes some teams don't have that mindset. So I'm not going to mention a particular team I worked with, but there was a particular team I worked with where they were only interested in getting their bonuses at the end of the quarter. That was it. I could not do anything to empower them because they weren't interested and they didn't care that the product was any good or not. So in that case, I had to be more managerial over them, insist on certain activities and make them more accountable manually. But it's a much less effective way to work in general.
Interesting, yeah. Okay, so my last bit before any sort of further Q&A, really just talk about tools. So these are the tools that we use. But obviously, like I said, there's a lot of different ones. The point here is that, you know, there is no single solution, as I said, but keeping tools to a minimum is really useful. I don't think we've necessarily got the balance quite right. We're always kind of reviewing it and trying to work out how to improve it. But I'll just talk through these. So Notion, I don't know how many of you use Notion, but for us, it has now become basically the central hub for everything. We use it for all our task lists. We use it for all of our GDD documentation, all of our processes, all of our templates. It's incredibly powerful. It has timelines and roadmaps and everything on there. I would say, obviously, we don't have internal development. We work with external developers. So I think that, and they still use things like JIRA. So I don't know, I know teams that use Notion for dev roadmaps, but just to be clear, I haven't used it to manage an entire team, you know, on a day-to-day task list basis, but I know teams that do. But again, it might be that you'd want to use two different ones. And then Slack, I mean, obviously there's MS Teams and various others. You know, we were a remote team before COVID, and we will always be a remote team. So, you know, Slack is essential for us, but using Slack in the right way is really important. You know, it isn't good at recording things in certain ways. So, you know, you have to be careful kind of how to use it. But Slack apps are really important. So I mentioned Task on Bots and Cloverpop. There's another one we use called Attendance Bot, which is not production related, but is to do with tracking holidays and sick days and stuff like that, which is really helpful. And it tells us, you know, each day it pops up on Slack. And at the beginning of the week, it says, you know, so-and-so is on leave this week. And it just automates all that kind of information. There's a huge amount of apps out there. Some are really crap and some are really good. So it's just finding one that works for you. I would say that Slack Pro is incredibly useful, mainly because if you're working with third parties, you can link into their systems, and so their Slack account. That for us is important, but that may not be the case for everybody. We still use Dropbox for file storage. You know, I have considered whether we should be, you know, moving that somewhere else, but it just works for us. In particular, since I don't know how many of you use Dropbox or have noticed this, but you can now create Google Docs and Sheets from within Dropbox. So the files for those are actually saved in there. That's been a real game changer for us. So we still use Google Docs and Sheets, particularly where we've kind of got living documents that need to be updated. We've, you know, arguably we could start looking at whether we need that and use Notion instead, but we've just found, again, Notion isn't quite as good for things like that. So you just have to kind of work out what the best middle ground is.
Yeah, Notion has a bit of frustration because of the way it's very difficult to copy things out of Notion into all the things. You can export some things into PDFs and some CSV files, but it's not a seamless function. So it's not. It is a little bit of a trap, but it's really worth it for other reasons.
Yeah, exactly. And then Miro. So this is the one Oscar's obsessed with, but Miro, for those who don't know, is an online whiteboard. There's a few other, well, there was another one we used before, but we found Miro is the best. We use it for where we're doing any kind of interactive calls. So we run a lot of workshops, for example, we use it for that, but we are also now actually using it for most of our kind of flow diagrams, even for design. It doesn't have as much functionality as like if you're using OmniGraffle as a UX designer, but actually for kind of high level flows, it's just really efficient and quick and easy, and it's online and it's shared. So we've actually started using it for a lot more than we ever intended to, and we find it really a really key part of our sort of process now. And then we do use G Suite. So all our emails in G Suite. I don't use the Gmail client. I think most of the rest of the team do. I know Oscar does. I don't know what Emily uses actually. But obviously the good thing about G Suite is that, you know, you can then use any other email client. But we do use it for calendars and calls because Google Meet seems pretty good. And then I use Airmail as my email client, which I think is iOS and Mac only. But there are various other email clients out there. But as I said, like having a good email client for me is really key. And I just don't find that Gmail is enough. And then we still use Office, which I really wish that we didn't have to, because it's so offline and so kind of just doesn't really fit with everything else. But we still haven't found a better way of creating documents that are formatable, that are really well spell checked, and that are then easily turned into PDFs in a kind of, you know, outward facing format. So that it still exists, but if I could remove one thing, it would be Office. But currently there's just no other option. I don't find that Google has enough functionality to actually be able to remove it completely. And that is it. Are there any other questions? Oh, Oscar, you're on mute.
Good stuff. Yeah. So yeah, we've got a couple of questions for you. I'm going to pull together. So there was one that Jeremy mentioned right at the beginning, which felt to me like a really good question for the end. So apologies for not answering that one earlier, Jeremy. So basically it was, what's the most difficult hurdle that a traditional project manager could find themselves handling as a producer in games? Obviously your experience has been 100% video games. Actually I've done traditional IT historically as well. But what would you say was the biggest hurdle for somebody coming from a traditional project management function into a games producer role?
I think, I mean, if you're talking, I mean, so I'm answering this specifically thinking about like if you came from like managing other digital media or like a product of some kind. The different, I think, you know, the biggest challenge is that there is this element of, is it fun? You know, so you cannot, so rather than GDD being a specification, you have to think of it as a hypothesis. And a hypothesis that is going to be proved or disproved. So, you know, you write something, you say, this is how the game's going to work. You then have to try it and see if it works, and it may not work. Now, for software, I know that does happen, obviously, but not to the same extent. And I have actually managed software projects as well. So, and it's always a thing that I've worked also with a lot of people who've come into games from other medias, particularly either linear, so TV or film, but also kind of software. And it's always the biggest problem that I get is that, you know, it's interactive, but it's also got to be fun. And I think, but from how that applies as a producer is how do you keep things on track when essentially everything that is planned could be wrong.
I'll go into that a little bit. So I've worked with SAP development in the past, large platform development, all sorts of things. The biggest issue really has come from Prince 2 style methodology to kind of an agile type environment. Now, I happen to think that there's lots of value in these kind of waterfall, this kind of longitudinal planning strategies for the big picture. I think there's some really good value in that. But because games is so iterative, to Ella's point, because we're about trying to find the fun, creating space to iterate, creating headspace is a real challenge. And it's a cultural difference in terms of IT departments versus non-IT departments. And in fact, actually, what I'll do is, Emily, if you want to put your camera on as well. So obviously, Emily is one of our producers as well. Now, obviously, hey, so you're on mute, by the way, Emily.
Yeah.
So you've come in as you come off a game design course, gone straight into games. But have you noticed any kind of particular key observations that you think is important for people to sort of understand? If they were to come from another industry to games, what would you think would be important?
So from another industry to games,
well,
it's
just your experience in general, but if you can think about how other industries might work, that'd be interesting too.
So my experience from sort of starting from like the more general studying to become a producer and working in the industry, there's a lot of nuance and small things that I sort of found along the way. So what Ella was saying, sort of the different style of managing, and sort of realizing that some producers and some managers are just amazing at processes and sort of like thinking in structures and things like that, where other people are just amazing at dealing with people. And for me, that was a big thing, with sort of realizing that, oh, I'm better at this part, and sort of identifying what I needed to get better at was a really big thing for me, to sort of realize what areas I needed to focus on to grow.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's also potentially quite difficult is when you're dealing with like big personalities, someone like me, who's a nightmare, as I know you know. You know, I think my impression is that what's helped you being able to tell me I'm being an idiot, as you should often, is that we've spent time talking about things not just about the game, not just about the company. I think that's helped a lot. Do you agree? Is that an important factor, or am I just making that up?
No, I guess that's part of it too, to sort of like, yeah, and yeah.
It just feels like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, to
about building
build, yeah,
confidence, isn't it?
Yeah.
yeah, and about building relationships. But just to finish off on the kind of coming from another industry, I think just in terms of, you know, how do you handle the kind of hypothesis approach and the fun, the way, you know, from my point of view, yes, you can have a kind of waterfall overall project view, but ultimately you have to build in time to iterate, and you have to assume that that's going to happen. So, you know, not trying to define everything up front is really important, but sometimes that's really difficult because you have a fixed budget or fixed time. So if you have fixed budget or fixed time, then you have to have a flexible feature list, basically. And, you know, you can't have both. You cannot, well, unless you don't have any limit on budget or time or scope, you have to either time box things or budget box things, or you know, have an open budget and time. You can't have both. So, you know, with clients, if you're working with clients or with, you know, any kind of stakeholders, it's really important to set expectations. Are we defining this by budget and time? And if so, the feature list has to be flexible. If we're defining this by features, then the budget and time has to be flexible. And this is where the kind of absolute priority thing comes in, because if your features are flexible, then using absolute priority order and getting the stakeholders to agree to the absolute priority order is really important. You know, so you don't have tasks that are features that are P1, P2, P3. You have them in absolute priority order. You say, we will do them in this order, and we can't guarantee how far we're going to get. In reality, you'll probably have something where people will say, well, you have to get the first five done. Okay, fine. You know, in reality, that works. But having an absolute feature list that says, you know, priority list that sort of says this is how we're going to work through them, but we can't guarantee how far we're going to get, it is inevitable. Because if you don't do that, if you are stuck to features and budget and time, the game will probably fail. And so I think that's the difference. Whereas with software, you know, it's a lot easier to say these are the things we need, and this is the time and budget we have, and have sort of flex within those. It's a different kind of limit. I don't know if that's answered the question. If it hasn't, let me know.
I just want to chuck an extra thing in, which is, as a designer, one of the reasons why I'm so attracted to living games in particular is because I don't have to give up features. And so when you have this absolute priorities, it really forces you to decide what's important, because you know, are you going to have an improved UI for a particular screen, or are you going to have a new gameplay feature for some other area of the game? And if you've got to decide between the two, you've got to only one at the P1, you can't just say P1. You've got to decide which one is going to be on top of the other. And I've had so many features that have been so important to me emotionally for a game, for a service, that I've had to kill because of my own decision about its priority. And it's incredibly revealing when you defer features that you know would be amazing because they're not important enough for the customer, the player experience. And I think that's one of the biggest changes from moving from traditional IT back when I was very, very young to now.
Just two other thoughts. One is, and I know this is a thing that they do in software generally, but just that I think is even more important in games, like having time for kind of tech debt. So having time to actually do all those little fixes that you want, and not letting those get in the way of the main development. The other thing, I talked earlier about kind of how you break down GDDs with kind of a high level section and then a detailed section. There is another reason that we do that, which I didn't mention in this, but the reason is that the rule we have is that the high concept, so that kind of high overview, that is basically set, right? That is kind of the overall goal of the game and kind of our vision for the game. The GDD, we build out as we go, and that builds out the detail from the high concept. Now, the rule is, if we want to change something in the GDD, that's okay. It doesn't need kind of major decision making and, you know, a big discussion. But if what we want to change would change anything in the high concept document, that raises a red flag and it has to be considered much more detailed and has to get sign off from people. Because basically what we're saying is that there's got to be room to do a lot of small iteration and to find the fun in each feature. But if we're literally going to change the actual features, so if we're literally going to change the game from, like, you know, ranged combat to melee combat, for example, like, sorry, just keep going back to that example. I don't know why. Clearly, I want to play a fighting game right now. But you know, then that requires a bigger decision, and being able to know as a producer when it's something that you can just say yes to, and when it's something you need to escalate, even if that's to yourself, like if you're the only person, even if it's to you and sort of changing the vision of the game, or to stakeholders or your boss or whoever else, that's really important, knowing that difference. And I think that, for me, I find is less of an issue in software, just because there is less iteration that could affect the overall goal. I still think it applies, but I think it's more important in games.
And just to follow up, so Jake's highlighted there's a parallel to this in design pillars. I personally hate design pillars as an idea. It's a terrible approach in my head, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually right on it. The reason I hate it is because I've seen it misused by management in so many bad ways. That's why we try to have a system which is defined in the high level concept. So by looking at the high level concept as a system, we avoid the barriers that pillars can create. And that's the difference for me personally. That's why I'm the approach we take.
Yeah, and I think it basically is, Jake, it is kind of design pillars, but it's like it's thinking in a system rather than just in isolated pillars. That's the difference.
Exactly.
And for me, that's really useful because a game is a system. And I think without the risk with design pillars, if not done right, is that you forget something. Whereas if you're forced to think of it in a system, you really have to focus in on what is actually important. Because I see, you know, design pillars in pitch decks of things like, you know, that are the developers feeling about it rather than what's actually necessarily important. And so I think thinking about it in system can be really helpful. But also, as I sort of mentioned earlier, being able to, I think the good thing about design pillars is that people generally have 3. And I think that is a good, so, you know, we always say 3 to 5 core features. And by the way, it drives designers mad when you make them define a game by 3 to 5 core features in a single flow loop.
We don't just say 3 to 5 features. What we say is 3 to 5 steps. That's even more restrictive than 3 to 5 features. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, I used to write exams for AQA for their tech levels. And I used to put a question in about this, about take a game that you like and write and draw its 3 to 5 key features. And it was probably the toughest question in the exam, because breaking down a game that exists into those is actually, and if you want to learn, get better at it, that's what you need to do, because I've done it with so many games and I've never found one that can't be broken down into 3 to 5, even EVE Online, just gonna say.
Well, we'll have to see if we can get Jake to do a 3 to 5 features on a solitaire game at some point, but that might be a bit. To Jeremy's question then, well, he's more of a concept. He says saying our GDD mindset works well with Prince 2. That's probably specific to the fact that that's how I learn. I'm not a good producer, but when I have had to be a producer, and I was taught Prince 2 methodology approach, although I never took the exams, and that's probably had a big influence on why we use the same kind of model, because it's all about marketing requirement documents, PIDs. It's all of these sort of structural functions that you would use in a Prince style methodology. but we've applied it much more to a kind of agile style mindset. So
I've been trying to write an article or a template or even maybe a book about how to write GDDs for years, and I still haven't got my GDDs to a point where I'm happy with them enough to do that. Like, that's how difficult I think writing a GDD is, because it, you know, if you spend more time writing a GDD than building the game at the beginning, you're doing it wrong. Like, it needs to be a living document. It needs to be easy to understand for developers and designers and stakeholders. Like, it's so difficult, and we definitely have not got it right. Like, we definitely, you know, and I think the thing is, you have to accept that you're never going to define everything, and I think that's once you accept that, I think it's okay. But then working out how to keep it relevant and up to date at the same time is really difficult. I think we're pretty good at it, but there's still so much more.
We don't adhere to some of our own rules sometimes where we know we should. For example, I'm a big fan of UML, so, you know, use case, user journey style language. And although we try to always put it in there, sometimes it's complicated to make sure that you put enough time in, because you're just going to make the thing to make sure you know it's going to work. And retrofitting that is problematic. Anyway, so anyway, that's why I think we have a similarity in tone, the way we look at GDDs, the Prince 2, but we're closer to the one pager, but we do one page for each feature, and we're trying to do 3 to 5 features. Yes, exactly. The list of books. So basically, this has been coming up by most people on the call. Ella, I think you mentioned that you had a list of books. Do you have them to hand?
I will.
Something we should collate?
I don't, but I wanted to go to my office and just look at what's there, because I'm in the middle of moving house, so it's all a bit chaos, but I will try and do that. The one that we read, that Emily and I think both read most recently, was actually a book on Kanban, which is obviously a style of Agile. And the reason I think that's really important is that we all assume, or certainly I used to, I can't talk for you, but I think a lot of people in games assume that Agile means sprints. And I think it's really useful to read a book that shows that Agile does not mean sprints, and there are different ways to do Agile. You know, I don't believe that any one technique is right. I think you need to kind of take the bits from waterfall, from Agile, and from different types of Agile that work for you. But the Kanban book really helped me to think about you know, different ways to apply Agile. And again, I haven't used it all at all, but I have found it really useful. So that's one I would recommend. And then the 1 Minute Manager. I'll have a look at what else. So the difference between design pillars. So, okay, so a step system overview. So basically, I'm trying to think of an example.
About dynamic versus static. Pillars we see as static. They're normally an emote of some sort around the nature of the game, talking about kind of, not always, but they're often around the emotional response of a player, whereas we're trying to define the game more in terms of a kind of connected journey. So that's why we tend to find sort of pillars.
So I'm just thinking, so I'm going to do this on the fly, so I might get it wrong, but just like that, we would, you know, that sort of Cooking Mama style game, you know, the restaurant game we were looking at the other day, Oscar, like, you know, if you've got a conveyor belt of stuff coming in and you've got to serve customers, you know, for that, you know, the flow would be, you know, start the game, you know, start a level, you know, get customers, serve customers, get rewards, share socially, maybe, as an example. And you know, that sounds really simple, but that is actually the 3 to 5 core features. If I was talking about design pillars, I don't know what I would say actually, but but you know, that
we say the creation, puzzle solving, and fulfillment, you know, that sort of thing. I mean,
yeah, and they're both valid, but I just find the breaking, and then for each of those core features, so in the sort of start game feature, I would talk about, you know, how the menu works a bit and how you get into the game, and, you know, the different kind of modes. And then in, you know, get customers, I'd obviously talk about, you know, how the game gets faster and how you've got different customers coming in and so on. And then in, you know, serve the customers, I'd talk about the conveyor belt and how that works. And then in rewards, I'd talk about scoring and, you know, what rewards you get and unboxing. And then in sharing, I'd talk about, you know, how do I play that with you know, with other people and so on. Yeah, actually, and Jake, just to your point, it is basically the core loop of the game. And then what we'll do, where we're talking about live games, which we exclusively are these days, you know, we then tend to talk about context loop and metagame, and they're almost like loops that sit around those. So they kind of become their own loop in themselves.
And if you break down
yeah.
what people often use as metagame, they're often meaning context loops, so the sense of purpose and progression of play. Whereas when we're talking about metagame, we're talking about kind of the lifestyle fit, the social collaboration and competition in the game, the zeitgeist that somebody would share that more publicly.
Yeah, it's basically the core loop is obviously is basically the loop that you will go around over and over and over and over and over and over and over to progress in the game.
Yeah,
that's the difference. Whereas design pillars are kind of just talking about the kind of, you know, like Oscar said, you know, maybe creativity and, you know, collecting and whatever else. Does that, I hope that makes sense.
Cool. Okay, so I think that's us done. I think we've gone through all the questions. Ella and Emily, thank you very much. Is there any last minute sort of one things you'd like to leave folks with before we close? Do you have any last comments?
I don't know. I don't. Emily, is there anything else you think that would be useful?
No, I think you covered so much of it. Like, it's been, I think it's been great.
Good.
Give her a pay rise. Anyway, that's great. So yeah, basically, so what we'll do is we'll send you guys the slides, a copy of the recording, and we'll also be getting Ella to pull together a list of all of her recommended book reading. I just, as an aside, I always recommend Dan Ariely's Predictably Irrational. I think that's a really useful book to read just because it helps you understand how people are often not doing what you think they're going to do and why. But we'll send you that. We're also going to do is we've just set up a Discord group so we can have ongoing conversations like this with people. And so we'll be sending that out later today or tomorrow as well. We're basically here as a living game publisher. So we're specifically looking to help teams who've got games with the ability to retain and sustain audiences over the longer term. And we now have the ability to be able to publish and support user acquisition as well. So please feel free to check us out. And if you want more talks like this, we keep doing them on a regular basis. And you can also go to our website and find the knowledge base section, where you'll find that there's a whole bunch of previous recordings, whether it's Ella talking about fundraising, Emily talking about what it's like to transition from a student to a game producer, or me talking about various forms of game monetization design. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ella and Emily, for helping out. And like I say, you know where we are, you know where you can find us.
Cool. Thanks all.
Thank you all.
Thank you.